Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Stephanie Rao, Executive Director at the National Council on Public History. Thank you so much for joining us for the second series and the second presentation of this week, exploring the National Park Service's criteria for establishing World War II heritage cities. Today, tomorrow, and Friday, we're going to learn about the criteria for purposes of applications and evaluation by Park Service staff from the authors of our essay series on the topic. Today, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Laura Oviedo on criteria 5, criteria 4, adaptations to wartime survival. Didn't mean to make anyone panic there. Tomorrow, we'll be talking about volunteer participation. A few housekeeping notes as we get started. This presentation is being recorded for those who can't attend and for anyone who wishes to be able to review the materials discussed. I will put a link in the chat shortly for the recordings from the series so far. Yesterday's presentation and those from this week will be added shortly. Closed captions have been enabled for this presentation. If you don't see them automatically, you can click the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please be sure to keep your microphone muted unless you've been called on to ask a question, but at any time you can pop questions into the chat area of your Zoom window, and we will work through those questions at the end of the presentation with Dr. Oviedo. And before the presentation begins, I also want to give a warm welcome to Jason Okrasa, who's joining us from the National Park Service and will offer some words of welcome.
Well, aloha, everyone. I'm stationed out here in Hawaii. I am the historian for the American World War II Heritage Cities program. So under the section 9007 of the John D. Dingell Jr. Conservation Management and Recreation Act of 2019, the Secretary of the Interior may designate only one city for a state or a territory as an American World War II heritage city. The intention is to recognize and ensure the continued preservation and importance of the history of the United States home front in the Second World War. There are currently 18 jurisdictions designated as American World War II heritage cities. As you heard from the historian yesterday, Turkaya Lowe, we are hoping in the next couple of weeks of adding to that number. The legislated criteria is twofold. First, contributions by a city or its environs to the Second World War home front war effort. And second, achievements by a city and its environs to preserve the heritage and legacy of a city's contribution to the war effort and the preservation of World War II history. Within these, there are 15 topics pertaining to the war effort, contributions, preservation, and communicative activities. The National Park Service is excited to partner with NCPH and the criteria essay authors to further explore these topics. And we hope you are able to join us for the other webinars. As you heard, there are 2 more this week. For more information, we have already provided, thank you, Kathleen, for our email page, American World War II Homefront's program website. And she has also added our email if you have any further questions.
Thank you so much, Jason, and thank you to the Park Service for working with NCPH and all of these wonderful historians on this project. It is now my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Laura Oviedo, who is an educator and public historian of the Latinx experience in the United States. Her research interests focus on Latinx civil rights, labor, belonging, and war. She's currently working on her first manuscript that narrates how national and hemispheric politics of race, democracy, and militarization shaped the lives of Latinas in Texas and Puerto Rico during World War II, examining the roles of Mexican American and Puerto Rican women as servicewomen, military family members, factory workers, youth volunteers, and sex workers, offers an opportunity to learn how the war had distinct effects on Latinas, especially Latinas living in a heavily militarized U.S. colonial territory. Dr. Oviedo's research has been supported by the Smithsonian Institution, Society for Military History, University of Texas Austin Center for Mexican American Studies, Texas A&M University, Institute of Caribbean Studies at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras, among other institutions. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Jason, and the entire team at NCPH and NPS for putting this together again. This is the second part of the series, and this is the second webinar presentation for this week. So we're halfway through, and today I'll be covering the essay that I wrote on adaptations to wartime survival. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I put together just a brief presentation for you all. Let me just... Okay. So like I mentioned, I'm going to cover a brief overview of the historical context of wartime shortages and rationing during the war, and then I'll dive into examples of what type of adaptations from communities across different parts of the US that I found, including Puerto Rico as well. So before the war, US imports were dominated by rubber, coffee, and sugar, but that all halted when the war began because most of these products were imported from access markets. And as more food items became essential for troops, communities, and individuals rose to the challenge presented by the government to contribute to the new wartime economy and mobilization efforts, including rationing. After the US declared war on December 8, 1941, manufacturing focused on producing for the war and the military. This was supported through the Office of Price Administration, a federal agency whose main responsibility was to make sure that price was controlled and consumption was limited for overall items that might be affected by the war. By 1942, the Office of Price Administration, which later became the War Production Board, had converted all appliance and automobile factories into production floors for military aircraft, weapons, and vehicles. Food being grown and canned was sent to the military and allies overseas, and most or the war production aimed at military support. With this production aimed at military support overseas, Americans faced a shortage of gas, oil, rubber, meat, fat, butter, vegetables, and other necessities. Rationing and government campaigns encouraged housewives, youth, and every able body to grow as much food in victory gardens, recycle, and limit their consumption of necessities that were not needed. In 1943, the government had purchased 80% of the lower grades of beef produced in the US. 40% were of beef cuts, 30% of butter, 30% of veal, 30% of all lamb, and 50% of all canned fruits and vegetables. Meats, especially, were stressed as fuel to sustain soldiers. And as a substitute, the government or these campaigns actually encourage people to grow soybeans as a substitute for protein, something that could be grown at home, but provide that protein that they were missing from the meat that was being sent overseas for military use. Others were encouraged to salvage fats for explosives. In fact, in 1943, the Texas government recognized housewives for quote, salvaging 300 pounds of used kitchen fats per month, enough to supply the glycerin for 60,000 pounds of nitroglycerin every month. So think of this, the fats, and when I first started doing this research on rationing and what these materials or oils and fats were being used for, I remember growing up with my mom saving the fat from the bacon that she would grill on that she would cook with, and she would save it. And when I was younger, I tell my students is when I was younger and I would look at my mom doing this, I'm like, what is she doing? That's kind of gross. Like, how is she reusing that fat? I mean, but as I started to get older, I was like, oh, that's kind of smart. You know, she's salvaging this fat and being resourceful with it. And then as you know, as I became a World War II historian and realizing, oh wow, this actually made nitroglycerin, you know, it provided the essentials for explosives needed for the war. It was kind of, you know, no pun intended, but mind-blowing, right? And when I bring this up with students in my classroom about how even just, you know, salvaging fats made from bacon fat, they were like, oh, my mom used to do this. And they start to really rethink about how they can, anyway, how they can reuse some of these essential materials. Sorry, I went off on a bit tangent there. The memory of my mom with that bacon fat kind of came in there with the kitchen fat. War ration books with stamps were also used to regulate meat, dairy, coffee, dried fruits, jellies and jams, lard, shortening, and oils. The ration books were also used to ensure that there was a fair distribution of foods in short supply. The way rationing books worked were that citizens were provided an authorized limit on certain items that they could purchase at stores. And when they were ready to pay, they presented these ration books so that the store cashier could collect the stamps for the items purchased. The stamps that you see here on the slide, which I'm sure that you all are very familiar with. Once people used all their stamps, they had to wait for a new ration book that was purchased every month. The purpose of these ration books was to prevent the overconsumption of these goods that could be used towards the US military and productions of war. By the end of the war, 5 billion ration books had been distributed to communities across the United States, and these were administered by nearly 8,000 ration boards across the country. Because certain staples in the kitchen were limited, cooks in the kitchen, which tended to be women in the household, made it a point to stretch out ingredients so they could be used for longer periods of time. Local clubs and organizations were central to encouraging other community members, friends, and family to adapt to changes for the greater good of the war, reserve goods, and grow victory gardens. So if you have had a chance to read the essay, or when you get the chance, I include in my essay specific examples of community organizations, even men's clubs in certain areas of the country that used their resources, whether it was money or, you know, newsletters that they printed out to encourage individuals to grow their own gardens and preserve goods. This also, you know, we think about the adaptability, right, and allowing them or giving citizens an opportunity to grow their own gardens, and some for the first time. This also engaged these kind of new cultivators of these victory gardens in a way to become part of an agricultural community that they otherwise would not have been a part of. Well, for one of the primary examples of adaptability, I'm going to dive into the Gardens for Victory, or also known as Victory Gardens. And this was one of the most popular campaigns that was renewed from the World War I mobilization efforts. The campaign was essentially a media blitz. It included magazines, newsletters, and pamphlets that encouraged and promoted the use of home gardens to alleviate demands from commercial productions that could be used for the military. By the end of the war, you know, people asked, was this successful? Well, by the end of the war, it's estimated that about 20 million victory gardens were created during the World War II period. So similar to President Roosevelt, if you tuned in yesterday and, you know, thinking about the defense bonds that were sold during World War II, defense and then the war bonds, President Roosevelt went on air on broadcast to publicize the sale and the sale of the bonds, and he became the first one to purchase one. Well, in similar fashion, the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, in 1943, planted a victory garden in the White House. Like her husband, the First Lady wanted to set an example for Americans to follow by witnessing her initiative and planting a home garden herself. The photo that I have here, if you're not familiar with it, was taken on May 10, 1943, and this depicts Diana Hopkins, daughter to Roosevelt's presidential advisor, Harry Hopkins. She was given a 2x2 plot on the White House garden where she was growing beans, carrots, and tomatoes, and she was, they took a picture of her working on it as her father behind her. The publicity provided by the First Lady's Victory Garden was a success because it was reported that an estimated 315,000 pressure cookers were sold to Americans just that year alone. Where were Victory Gardens located? Victory Gardens could be found in rural and urban centers. Women and children grew tomatoes, lettuce, soybeans, again, like I mentioned earlier, for protein, and cabbage, other fruits and vegetables as well. In urban areas where there wasn't a lot of space, or maybe communal areas, people were growing Victory Gardens in their rooftops, some in their backyards, and if they had the space for it, neighborhood gardens. Public spaces also included town squares on property of city buildings, similar to the ones of the photos that you see here. Examples of urban community victory gardens is seen in Cleveland, Ohio, on the left, right above the text right here. So this is the in front of the Cleveland, Ohio City Mall, where they cultivated a community garden for the entire community to participate in. Another similar example was in San Francisco. San Francisco created a victory garden in front of their city hall in 1943, and this is a photo that I took from the public library that they made available. San Francisco also made a victory garden, I should say that the Golden State Park had a victory garden as well. So, I mean, I'm pretty sure if you, in your city or townships or jurisdictions, that you're going to find not just individuals growing in their homes, but you're going to see these public spaces, very public spaces, being used to cultivate these victory gardens. By 1944, homegrown gardens contributed to 40% of the US produce and 8 million tons of food by the end of the war. These victory gardens were also extremely popular, or I shouldn't say extremely popular, they were being led or being produced in the school, being taught on why they were growing their own vegetables and their own fruits. And then they were taught how to do it. Very hands-on experiment, as you see here with kindergarten students in Benjamin Franklin in May 1942. This was also in San Francisco. So again, schools like Santa Maria High School in California, they created their own Food for Freedom garden on a 3-acre plot. In Puerto Rico, the Office of Price Administration partnered with the Department of Education to create an educational program titled Education for Victory. This program aimed to teach Puerto Ricans about the importance of the roles in World War II. Like youth and communities in the continental United States, Puerto Rican school children were encouraged to grow gardens at school and at home. One of the benefits that the Puerto Rican community had was that it was already a largely agricultural working class peoples. So when schools began teaching students about the purposes and how-tos of growing gardens, students were already familiar to an extent. They even got parents involved. One such example was in Maya West, Puerto Rico, where schools were promoting the Huertos de la Victoria, translated to victory gardens. Parents were donating their tools to the schools for students to use and volunteer their time to come help teach and cultivate alongside their children. However, I must point out that the irony in this specific campaign aiming to not to get not only Puerto Rican students, but their parents involved in a victory garden when Puerto Rico's agricultural economy was struggling and there was numerous agricultural labor strikes fighting for livable wages. And I must say, before I move on to the next one, that this, Victory Garden, grow your own food, was campaigns within schools. It wasn't the first time during World War II. You see this being implemented in schools. That it was an implementation that was supported by this progressive movement, where they wanted children to have that connection back with nature. They also wanted them to have a more conscious, they wanted them to be more conscious about foods that they were putting into their bodies. So this was kind of a long effort that started before World War I with a progressive movement. But of course, during wartime, it's kind of campaigned in a certain way for mobilization efforts abroad. One of the most popular ones, and probably I would say consider them one of the most popular photos of the Women's Land Army of This Life magazine photo that you see there, is one of the organizational efforts of helping with rationing, but also as a form of adaptation and sustainability, was creating and reviving the Women's Land Army of World War I. This was part of an effort by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, where they got the women's land armies to participate in urban gardening and rural farming in order to fill in for 3 million farm workers who had gone to war or industry since 1940. Most of these women had not worked on a farm before, so they were able to develop skills that would help their home and their nation at the same time. Women who joined this formal agricultural organization, where they drove tractors and trucks, picked fruits, milked cows. And as you see here on the cover of Life magazine, they appeared and they did a story on the Women's Land Army on September 27, 1943. By the end of the war, 1.5 million had served in the Women's Land Army. So when it came to fashion, one of the industries, not just business-wise, but also even in social aspects that was impacted was fashion. Because a lot of these materials that were used by women or just on clothing, a lot of that was needed for a wartime effort. So women, and I should say the fashion industries had to really make a lot of adaptations, right, to the way that they styled themselves and what they were able to use during wartime. One of the most popular sources, I should say, were nylon and silk. By 1941, the Office of Price Administration had already seized the supply of raw silk, and there became a frenzy of people trying to get these silk stockings. And then when with only nylon stockings, and the price rose, these materials like nylon was used for parachutes and for chemicals needed for the war. Nylon was also used to make the rope stronger and to supplement rubber, because if you stretch nylon stockings, or you start to see kind of how it stretches out, well, they would kind of dismantle or deconstruct these stockings and then turn them into rubber material used for military vehicles or tire production. And DuPont, now that we know DuPont, then became part of the War Production Board, in charge of the stocking nylon and war materials. In the picture here that you see, they encouraged women to donate their used stockings, whether they were silk or nylon, because they were made into powder bags for the Navy. They were melted down and also respun into nylon thread for parachute production. So a lot of these silk and nylon hosieries were really important for a lot of the materials that the military would use. Again, in 1943, the state governor, Coke Stevenson at the time, put out an announcement, a statewide announcement, and reported and announced that women of Texas had turned in 1,500,000 pairs of old silk and nylon hosiery for the manufacture of powder bags and parachutes. Conserving materials like wool and cotton also impacted the 1940s fashion. In fact, in February 1942, the War Production Board, which is previously the Office of Price Administration, had met with fashion industry representatives, including the vice president of Neiman Marcus, to try to come up with a plan on how to refashion their clothing to where it would become war production friendly and also allow women to still feel like they were dressing up in the fashion that they wanted, but making sure that they reduce the material that they used, and their target rate for that reduction of material use was at 15%. So that was their target rate, to at least use 15% less material. So with this, dresses became a little shorter. Clothing accessories like vests and cuffs, double-breasted suits and pleats and ruffles were no longer worn. And one of the fun facts that a lot of people, or I should say maybe people that are more familiar with World War II history, is that because of these rationing in even clothing, that one of the creative ways that women adapted to these changes to their fashion was that they turned to makeup, or to eyebrow pencils, or anything with ink to draw on that faux seam that stockings had on their legs. So you would see them with that fake kind of line kind of running through it, just to make it look like if they had stockings on. Again, with this, with the efforts of trying to reduce the material used in order to provide that for soldiers abroad, and even the shoes, the rubber, everything, there were social repercussions, and I'm going to bring up a study, a case study about that kind of the, not the dark side, but kind of the consequences of, this wartime fervor of what rationing meant to the mobilization efforts, but what it also meant to people, to American society connecting, or those who connected the use of material to being un-American and therefore being against the war in some way. So, again, with rationing measures being taken seriously, and a perfect example of the social repercussion to not conserving as much material came to a head in East Los Angeles. In the 1940s, Mexican American youth embraced the fashion-inspired trend of the zoot suit, which you'd see here in this photo of this young man. The men wore the fashion-inspired trend of the zoot suit, which drew on Black jazz culture of the 1930s. Men wore high-waisted, long watch chain tucked into their front pockets, and women wore similar coats, these long coats, but with a knee-high length skirt and a high-haired bouffant. In Mexican-American communities, this fashion trend was known as Pachuco culture. However, when a murder of a young Mexican-American died as a result of a rivalry between Mexican-American youth, the Pachuco clothing style became associated with youth delinquency. It also didn't help that the media at the time was creating Pachuco wearing youth as criminals. This imagery in the media produced a social campaign that depicted Pachucos as un-American and anti-war because of the extra material that their wide clothing used. As a result, service members and police ravaged the streets of LA looking for zoot suiters and attacked them and undressed them. The undressing part was a way to symbolically strip them of dignity, but also symbolically stripping them of that extra material that they had been using. In early 1942, rubber was rationed and gas rationing followed in 1943. In June 1943, the government launched a rubber drive and pleaded with Americans to collect and donate old tires, raincoats, garden hoses, shoes, bathing caps, and gloves. These materials would be used to provide footwear, clothing, and equipment for soldiers and for tires in construction of military aircraft, vehicles, and battleship. In Mount Vernon, the Boys and Girl Scouts became integral volunteers who rode from house to house on their bicycles seeking donations. One of the other things that I found with these rubber campaigns was that a lot of these campaigns were done locally by youth organizations, by church organizations, and other community and civil organizations that were really became the foot soldiers of kind of campaigning for these salvaging efforts. This photo that you see here is again one of the Girl Scouts organizations. There was also, I know for a fact that there was also other Girl Scouts organizations even in Hawaii, like running these kind of campaigns and trying to seek donations to donate back to the government. For rubber usage, tying into the rubber usage, gas was also restricted to a few gallons per week, and pleasure driving became illegal. Civilians began carpooling to save on trips to stores, work, or social visitations. In some of my research in Puerto Rico, what I found throughout newspapers was a lot of op-eds or even just articles highlighting how some people were taking advantage of, the gasoline rationing, and, people were calling out individuals in newspapers, and airing out people's, I guess, private time in their vehicles. And, this person was using this vehicle late at night and they're not supposed to be out because we're supposed to be saving for the gas, saving gas for the war effort. So it kind of became kind of like a policing campaign on how much individuals drove, how much they were conserving as far as gas and rubber, right? Because tires are made of rubber. So if you're driving more than needed, then you're also wasting the rubber that you already have. So I found that really interesting that it kind of became this campaign in newspapers to really call out people that were not abiding by these rationing needs during the war. Scrap metal drives were more successful than rubber salvaging campaigns. In Oregon, young and old, they collected aluminum, paper, tin, and steel. The War Production Board created the Oregon State Salvage Board in 1942, and that drew in about 46 volunteers that created programs and policies to run these statewide campaign efforts. And then they would partner with local salvage boards, and they were launching localized and statewide campaigns where high schools, one notably in Tiny Powers High School in Oregon, collected 14,000 pounds of scrap metal, and they actually won the national record. In Portland, students were also recognized for 200 tons of scraps. In Klamath Falls, local theaters partnered with youth organizations such as the Boys and Girl Scouts and Campfire Girls to collect 5,250 pounds of cans and glass Clatsop County contributed over 23 train cars loaded with tin. So it's important to point out, I would say, in this section that it was interesting to read or to learn about. It's always interesting to learn about the different ways that they kind of run these campaigns, because like, as you see here, you have the national board, you have the state boards, and then the local boards, if these townships or cities have them. But they would use like competitive tactics to get people to contribute to these salvage campaigns. And yes, it was like, be patriotic and show loyalty to the nation and, you know, contribute as an American citizen. But it was also like, hey, how are you going to let the next town over get collect more scrap metal than you? How are you going to, you know, how are you going to allow this other school of, you know, whether it's elementary schoolers or middle schoolers to be more successful in collecting all of these materials that were needed? So it kind of became, I would say that local boards, state boards, and national boards, especially I would say at the local level, kind of really drew from that competitive spirit to motivate individuals to salvage more than needed. In Nebraska had two historic cannons that had been used in the Civil War, and they were in the courthouse. But when they were asking for these materials, they ended up donating those two cannons for military use. President Roosevelt actually recognized this significant contribution, and he invited other cities and county halls to do the same. Those two cannons alone from Phelps County, Nebraska, provided the military with over 14 tons of iron that was melted down to construct and reformed into ammunition and ships and aircraft. In Oregon, they also started using unused streetcar lines and streetcar lines that were unused. Some of my other research, as far as more individual or church oriented, were taken from some of the interviews done by the Voices Oral History Project at the University of Texas, Austin. I've gone through over, I would say, 80 of those oral histories alone with just women during World War II. And a lot of these salvage campaigns were being contributed, at least in Texas or in the South Texas region, by Mexican American youth. And they were primarily running these campaigns or contributing to these salvage campaigns through church. So the church would actually host these little campaigns. One of the examples was Mary Resendes, who joined her church's effort to collect tin, and her quote she says that, quote, "We'd open up the tin cans on both sides and then put the lids in the middle of the can and then smash them down. They picked the cans up, or we took them to church in bags, and somebody would take them." So you have Mary Resendes from South Texas, including Linda, Marta, plus like 4 other young ladies in Central Texas who helped recycle scraps of metal and tin and took them to church bags. So for Mexican American communities, as far as I can tell in my research, the church became a central location for them to contribute to these rationing and salvaging campaigns. So for people doing research or wanting to figure out what sites their city has to offer when it comes to this kind of subject, churches, I would say, would be a conventional, or it would be a really great resource to start looking at any records that their church had, if their church had any involvement in these type of campaigns. And I believe that is it for today. Again, there's more specific There's more specific details in my essay. You can go ahead and ask me. And there's also a little bit more information or other research that I found that I use in my own research when it comes to, I would say, Texas. But I would say, again, pointing to my own research, one of the most important resources that I ran into when trying to look at specific numbers on what was collected, how much was conserved, and who was involved. A lot of that came from state records, at least for the Texas governor. He was putting out announcements with specific numbers of contributions that Texans made. I'm not sure, but it would be promising to look at other archives, state archives, with the governor's announcements during this period. I found them by accident because it wasn't marked. I wouldn't say it's not labeled properly, but it was just something that I wouldn't expect the governor to be announcing during this time. So that was an unexpected little pocket of archival treasure that really helped me put this essay together, and also my own research. And I'll end there.
Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. We already have a couple questions in the chat, so we'll start there, but folks, feel free to use the raise hand feature in your Zoom window if you would like to unmute and ask your question live, or you can put your questions right into the chat. Early on in your talk, Jason responded that, I remember my grandmother also saving the bacon fat. Do you know of any other things in Texas that stayed with the culture there due to rationing? And he notes that Spam became a staple where he is now in what was the territory of Hawaii as a result of World War II.
Yeah, Spam was also a central staple in my household growing up. So yeah, that totally makes sense, and I can make that connection. But so let's see, do you know of other things in Texas that stayed with the culture in Texas? Rationing. Other things that stayed as far as food wise, I can't really think at the top of my head. But one thing that I wanted to mention with Texas, and this might also, connect or, apply to other states along the US-Mexico border. But when supplies were being rationed during World War II, Mexican American communities across the border, in the South Texas border, would go over to Mexico to get those supplies. So when leather was rationed, or they weren't able to buy shoes, some of the oral histories that I've come across describe how their family would go over to Mexico just to go get shoes or to go get, stuff that was rationed. And I was like, oh, wow, again, this fits into the adaptation to survival. How are they going to, use or benefit from even their location along even the geopolitical border of the US-Mexico border?
Thank you so much. We also have a question from Kathleen Madigan, who asks if you would speak a little bit about the black market and about price fixing and their impact on rationing and prices.
So the black market, so I guess part of the going to the Mexico fits into that black market, because I know they, it's part of this effort to kind of to restrict and to limit these materials. They were the agency was very hypervigilant I should say, on what was being brought in through the black market. But if you think about it, you have these national boards, these state boards, and these local boards, but even the local boards they can't keep an eye on everything. So I mean, and you see that not only with these prices, but also, you know, when you look at, I mean, and I guess we'll get into that tomorrow, but looking even at these the Fair Employment Practices Committee, like these different committees created during World War II, even though they had a really important role, it was impossible to kind of keep an eye out for all these black markets. So speaking again towards, I can speak to the black market in Mexico and what was coming in and out, because I know that from the research that I've done that Mexican American communities along the border to take advantage of their relationship to people still in Mexico and to the and took advantage of the closeness of the border to be able to get some of those materials. But as far as if it impacted rationing and pricing, I cannot, I can't answer that question at the top of my head right now. I would want to make an assumption, but I don't want to make an assumption out there. This is recorded.
Thank you so much. And while we wait for any other questions that folks have to come in, I wanted to remind everyone that tomorrow at 4 Eastern, 3 Central, we will be joined again by Dr. Oviedo to talk about Criteria 5, volunteer participation, which, as you noted, I think will build really nicely on today's conversation. And then on Friday, we will have our last presentation of this series focusing on diversification of the American World War II homefront workforce. So any other last questions? Or well, thank you so much for this presentation, Dr. Oviedo. Thank you for making the time to join us again this week. And we look forward to your presentations tomorrow and Friday. And if folks, you know, at any point in this series, if you have questions about previous presentations, you're welcome to ask those as well. So if you think of anything later today, let us know tomorrow and we'll dig in a little further. But thank you all so much for your time.